amazing Amy Sutton.
Hello! Hi! Get off my stage.
I'm leaving.
I'm lurking Josh.
Hi everyone. I am going to be telling you a Cornish story tonight. And this story is called Duffy and the Devil. So it seems we have maybe a theme turning up over the evening. We'll see. So, it was cider season, and Squire Lovell of Trove was riding out to Bury and Churchtown to find any young people that he could who would come and help gather in the apple harvest. And as he was riding into town, he saw Jenny Chigwin. And Jenny Chigwin was making a terrible noise. She was howling and shrieking in the middle of a great big cloud of ash so thick that it caught in the squire's face and lungs and he could barely breathe. Jenny Chigwin had gathered up the soot from the fire in the hem of her dress, but she was now using that soot in the hem of her dress to beat about the head her daughter Duffy. And Squire Lovell came over and said, "What on earth is going on?" And Jenny Chigwin said, "Oh, Squire, my daughter Duffy, she is a wrong 'un. I'm chastising her because she hasn't done any of her chores. All she does is hang around with the boys and tumble into the haystacks. I can't do anything with her." And Duffy, brushing the ash and the soot from her face, said, "Don't you believe her, Squire? I can spin and knit better than anybody in this kingdom." And as she said so, she brushed a hand through her thick and luscious dark curls and batted her eyelids. And the Squire said, "Well, if you can spin and knit as well as you say, you shall come back to my house, for my old maidservant her eyesight is not as good as it once was, and you can pick up the slack for her." So up Duffy got onto the back of that fine horse, and back she went to the manor house, and there she was led up the rooms, up through the stairs to the very top of the house by the old maidservant, and she opened up the attic door. And there in the attic there was a spinning wheel, and from floor to rafter ceiling, the attic was filled with woolen fleeces. And the old maidservant said, "Well, my dear, if you can get started on these at least, that would be a help." And off she went back down the stairs, closing the attic door behind her. Duffy sat down on the little low stool in front of the spinning wheel, and she began to weep. For in truth, Duffy was not a hard worker. Duffy was lazy. Duffy liked to laze about. She liked to eat good food. She liked to enjoy the sun on her face. She didn't want to do housework. And truth be told, she didn't know how to spin fleece into wool. She didn't know how to knit yarn into stockings or clothes or linen or any sort of thing. She thought, really, that she was pretty enough that she probably wouldn't have to do that in her life. And so she sat on that low stool and she cried and she wept and she wailed and she stamped her feet and she cursed that pile of fleeces. And she said, "Well, as far as I care, the devil can spin and knit for the Squire." And no sooner had she said that, but there came a rustling from deep within the woolen fleeces, like a mouse or a rat or something scrabbling towards the surface, and then out came, tumbling down the woolen fleeces to land at her feet, the most curious little mannequin she had ever seen in her life. This was a little imp, barely taller than her knee, with a long, long pointed tail and a mouth twisted up into a smile on one side. And that little imp, he looked up at Duffy and he said, "Well, Duffy, I'll do your work for you if you like. Would you like that, Duffy?" And Duffy said, "Well, yes, I would." And the imp said, "You can be the fine lady and I will spin for you all day. Would you like that, Duffy?" And Duffy said, "Yes, yes, I would." And the imp said, "Well, there's only one thing then. I'll work for you for 3 years. And if at the end you can't work out what my name is, then you must come home with me." And Duffy thought to herself, well, how hard can it be to find out a name? And she agreed on the spot. And the little imp said, "Very well. Then all you need to do is wish, and any work that you need done will be done." Well, Duffy was free to loaf and laze about all day, sometimes occasionally summoning up enough energy to sing a snatch of a song, perhaps. And she lay there in that attic space for half the day, and all she had to do was remember to wish that this amount of fleeces had been spun into yarn, or that this amount of yarn had been knitted into stockings, and, well, the work was fine. The work was very fine. In fact, everybody who came across Duffy's handiwork swore that they had never seen fabric that had been knitted so well. The Squire Lovell himself, swore he would never wear another pair of stockings that had not been knitted by Duffy. He said that it didn't matter whether he went through bush or briar, through bramble or gorse, he stayed bone dry and he never once got scratched. And for Duffy, well, she could spend half the day up in the attic, lazing on those fleeces, watching the little imp working at that spinning wheel with a preternatural speed, or clacking away at the knitting needles with his fingers flashing like spiders' legs. And the other half of the day, she could go down to the mill where all the fine ladies of town would sit and wait for their grain to be ground, and they would tell each other stories, and they would dance. And when Duffy turned up, the miller could be persuaded to bring out his old violin, and his wife, old Bet, would get out one of those old circular sieves that had a sheepskin stretched across it, and old Bet would keep a beat on the sheepskin drum, and the miller would play on his violin, and Duffy would sing. Oh, this was the life. Now, Old Bet was a famous and much respected figure in town, for Old Bet was not only the miller's wife, but she was a wise woman. She was a witch. And so maybe that is why Old Bet was the only person who noticed that there was something very strange about the fine knitting that Duffy was producing. But she didn't say anything. She just kept her eyes open, and she watched, and she waited. Now, by this time, Duffy was becoming a very attractive proposition, and young men from all across the kingdom were coming by to try and court her and woo her and win her hand in marriage. And when the squire realised what was happening, rather than lose so good a spinner and a knitter, he decided that he would marry Duffy himself. And Duffy agreed, for now she didn't just have to play at being the lady. No, now she really was the high and mighty Lady Lovell. Oh, and Duffy kept that little imp busy. She got that imp spinning stockings and fine undergarments and quilts and linen and even tapestries. Their house was covered in these beautiful pieces of work that Duffy was passing off as her own. And Lady Lovell and Squire Lovell wore only the finest suits of clothes. But 3 years passes very quickly. What had seemed on one side to be an eternity of time was getting smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. And one day, when Duffy went up to the attic, that little imp's eyes were sparking like coals, and it looked at her with a grin and said, this year you will be mine. And so it went on, and time passed, and Duffy was no closer to guessing this little creature's name. This month you will be mine. And time passed, and Duffy racked her brains, but nothing she could think of could bring the name of this creature to her. This week you will be mine, until finally the day came where she climbed up into the attic, and that little imp's eyes were burning like fires, and it said, tomorrow you will be mine. And it cackled and it twirled its long, long tail. And Duffy didn't know what to do. So very sensibly, she went to somebody who she thought would. She went to the wise woman of the village. She went to old Bet, the miller's wife. And she told old Bet everything that had happened, and old Bet listened and said, I knew there must be some grave cost to such a skill. But don't you worry, my girl. You heed my words and you do exactly as I say, and all will be well. Old Bet told her that she would have to go back home and bring her a barrel of the strongest beer that the squire had in his cellar. And so she did. And then old Bet tucked the barrel under her arm, picked up that sheepskin sieve, and wrapped herself in a red cloak, and off she went into the gathering dark. The only other instruction she had left with Duffy was that she must stay up and wait for the squire to return from hunting, no matter how late it was, and that when he spoke to her of his day, that she was not to say a word, no matter what she heard. So back Duffy went to the manor house, and she watched and she waited as the night drew in. And the hunting dogs returned long before the squire did, covered in foam, their tongues lolling out. The servants said they looked as if they had seen the devil's headless hounds and had run back all the way without stopping. It was after midnight that the squire returned, and he returned with wild, shining eyes, with a grin plastered all over his face, and he was singing snatches of a song as he rode into the stable. Here's to the devil with his wooden pick and shovel. And he came into the house, throwing off his sodden, muddy cloak, laughing and giggling to himself. And he caught Duffy by the arm. Oh, my love, you must sit down. I must tell you this story. Oh, if you had seen what I had seen tonight, you would split in half laughing. And so they sat down at the great long table, and he told her what had happened. I had been riding since dawn, and I had not started so much as a hare the livelong day. The sun was coming down, it was almost nightfall, and I decided that I should turn around and head home and count the evening as lost. And as I turned, in the gathering dark, I saw a figure in a red cloak walking along the side of the path. And it seemed, in the gloom, that they vanished. And in the point where they vanished, suddenly a hare was darting across the forest floor, and of course all of the dogs gave chase, and what a chase it was! We went through water, we went through mud, until at last we came to a great broad pool, and there the dogs turned on their heels and fled back past me, whooping and wailing as if they were utterly terrified out of their minds. And Duffy, remembering what old Bet had told her, did not say a word. And the squire continued, well, I carried on a little further, and I saw around a corner the glimmer of a fire. And around that fire were gathering all of the witches of St. Leaven. There were some riding on ragwort, there were some riding on brooms, and some that must have gone earlier that day to Wales to milk the cows were riding in on great long leeks. They gathered around the fire, and there at the head was old Bet. And can you believe it? She had slung across her shoulders a barrel of my finest beer. Duffy listened and said not a word. And the squire continued, well, all of the witches gathered around the fire and blew on it, and it flared up into a bright, shining blue flame. And from that flame appeared the most curious little creature I have ever seen. He was so bizarre to look at. No bigger than your knee, Duffy, with a long, long tail that he twirled round and round and round. And once this little devil had been conjured, old Bet began to beat a tune on her sheepskin drum, and the witches began to sing. They sang, here's to the devil with his wooden pick and shovel, digging tin up by the bushel with his tail cocked up. And as they all sang, the devil and those witches began to dance around the fire, and every time that little imp made his way past old Bet, he took a great long swig from my beer barrel. Duffy listened, saying not a word. And he said, I couldn't help but watch. It was spectacular. It was so strange and so amusing until finally the little imp must have drunk too much, and he tumbled down onto the floor with all of the witches around him, and hiccuping and slurring, he sang out, my love. He sang, Lady Duffy, you'll never guess what. My name is Terry Top, Terry Top Top. Duffy went pale and red and then pale again, and Squire Lovell looked at her and said, why don't you laugh, my love? This is the funniest thing I have ever seen. And then Duffy did laugh. The first carefree laugh that she had given for many a long day. Well, the next day, she went up into that attic space, and she set that little imp to make as much linen and stockings and fine cloth, such an abundance that she would never want for it again. And as the sun crept towards the horizon on that final day, the imp looked at her with his smile growing wider and wider, with his eyes flashing, with his tail spinning faster and faster. And as the sun slipped below the horizon, the imp leapt up out of the little stool and said, well, Duffy, I have worked well for you for 3 years, so I will give you 3 guesses of my name. And if you get them wrong, you come home with me. And Duffy, feigning fear, said, well, I don't know. Is your name Lucifer? Lucifer? Lucifer, please. I don't even rate him. Is your name Beelzebub? Ooh, closer. Closer, a distant cousin of mine, but you're wrong, Duffy. And he reached out his long spider-like fingers to grab her around the waist, but she took a step back and said, well, then I suppose your name must be Terry Top. And the little imp looked up at her, and his eyes grew wide, and his jaw dropped down to the floor, and he gave a terrible shriek of frustration. He stamped on the floor, and where he stamped, sparks flew, and then in a puff of brimstone he disappeared, taking with him all of the work he had done. The tapestries evaporated into flame on the walls, the quilts disappeared into a pile of ash on the bed, the fine shirts, the stockings even the undergarments, leaving Lady Duffy and Squire Lovell in nothing but their boots and covered head to foot in ash. Thank you very much, everybody. Woo!